panel, colonialism exists on a tradition. It is a tradition of exploitation, of plunder, and from victimization. It is a tradition that exists to this very day when neo-colonials, MNCs, are able to exploit developing countries at an unprecedented rate. On Team Proposition, we're very proud to support countries that have been systemically excluded from the economic environment that they deserve to be a part of. Very proud to propose 3 things in the frame. Firstly, what does our policy look like? We think that countries like the UK and France, who have colonized a lot of the world, should be opening borders to countries like, for example, South Africa and Senegal that mostly exist within the global south. We think that the free flow of capital already exists in many parts of the world, but the free flow of humans does not. And that is something that we support on our side of the house. We support the broader idea of recompense for these people at the end of the day, but the motion only requires us to support policies like opening borders, but at the end of the day, we're willing to support other measures for this as well. The second thing is a bit of characterization how the global south looks like. That is to say, we think it's extremely hard to develop these countries at the end of the day, because they've been shackled by the colonialism that existed before it. The exploitation of taking away the money and the natural resources and the ability for these people to develop in the first place, that's been taken away from them systematically at the end of the day. Thirdly, what does OP have to defend in this debate? They have to defend that there is no obligation for these countries to even help them. Because at the end of the day, if someone has a moral obligation to do something, it means that any other sort of mechanism still falls under the broader idea that some sort of recompense is required at the end of the day. That is the side that opposition stands for. That is the side we just don't think is right. Firstly, what is the principle of retribution in this debate? Firstly, I'd like to ask, when is someone obligated to do something on a purely principle level? We think it's 2 reasons. Firstly, if they're directly complicit in some sort of harm to a certain actor, or secondly, if they're negligent to the harm that they could stop otherwise. How are colonial countries directly complicit in the exploitation of the global south? The first is because the precise injustices that the colonizers inflicted upon these people is, firstly, they took away their autonomy, their being. At the end of the day, the colonizing looks as people who are very rich and are able to actively annex a certain country, coming to countries that are less developed and culturally inferior, and having an excuse to take away their autonomy and take away their very state of being. Secondly, it looks like making them confined to their lands, at the point in which you disregard their bodily autonomy to do what they want at the end of the day. The third is that they take away their nationhood, because at the end of the day, colonizers looked at putting a flag on a foreign country that is necessarily not theirs. You take away their necessary connection that they have to a certain nation, to a certain people. We think that's problematic and should be abolished. The third is that you suppress, you actively plunder them. That is to say, theft is a very problematic part of colonialism. This happens in 2 ways. The first is that you have active stealing from them. This looks like stealing natural resources in many developing countries that are very rich from them, simply because you need to develop your industrial west. This looks like precious materials like diamond and gold who were taken out on mines and not given to the people in which they were in, but rather taken back to the museums and the rich at the top in the west. The third is that 200 years of free labor, that is to say effectively slavery. At the end of the day, if you take a calculation of the majority of people who have a wage in Mali, it's probably less than the 200 years that they've worked for these people and the products that they've made from it. But the second way that there is active plunder is through taxation without representation. That is to say, at the end of the day, these people are actively taxed, but they don't know where this money is going, and it's not actually helping them at the end of the day. Except for some collaborators in the local government, this exists precisely because at the end of the day, the parliament in most of the developing countries looks like only people from the countries that were actually colonizing these people in the first place, rather than an actual reflection of what the diverse cultural identity of these people are. This is exactly why the Salt March happened in India, because at the end of the day, the taxes weren't going to the people of India, they were only going to the rich at the top. Before I go on to the second part of this argument about negligence,
Do you believe that the well-to-do in Canada should be allowed to have free immigration at the expense of disenfranchised in nations that have never been colonized like Ethiopia?
If you can prove to us that the principle of retribution and everything that I'm going to talk about applies on this example as well, we're happy to do that. Otherwise, no. Second thing, about negligence, right? This is the second reason why we think that someone is actively obligated to do something. Firstly, we think puppet governments were actively left to do whatever they want by the centralized regime of the crown or of the French Empire. At the end of the day, it meant that they could rule with an iron fist. They could do whatever they want because they were systematically left alone to their own practices. But secondly, in status quo, negligence exists on a very, very large level. That is to say, MNCs being able to bully developing countries into harmful deals that actively harm their environment and their people. It means that why do MNCs necessarily link to the motion? Is because these very colonial countries that are rich and gain their money through colonization are able to actively stop them or somehow implicitly complicit in their system. One, if they're registered in a country, you're able to shut them down because they're evil. Secondly, most of these companies are actively funded by the government, like oil, because natural resources for these countries are necessarily important. The third is because many of these companies are gaining money through general government subsidies, which allow them to do this in the first place. But the second way is that the global north is actively repressing the global south through bilateral harmful trade deals, simply because they're able to have more political power and economic capital on the world stage, neglecting the ability for these people to actually develop at the end of the day. Why is this proportional? One, we allow access to benefits for the people themselves created, the people themselves through their hard work created within these countries, because that's the only reason why these countries are necessarily so rich. But secondly, it's recompense for the years of disenfranchisement and victimization, which we think is necessary. But the second thing is that this actually benefits people, and therefore would be also morally abhorrent that this isn't enforced. Firstly, the mechanism of opening borders gives 5 unique benefits. The first is remittances to these countries. That is to say, when people go to the UK from India, they many times send back money home, therefore they can actually develop the countries there. The second thing is know-how. At the point in which you, for example, study in Oxford or Cambridge, you're able to bring back the know-how to the country that you're in and actively help it develop as well. The third is active products that you're able to get at the point in which the global north is superior in terms of economic capital than the global south. You're able to get these products that you otherwise wouldn't. The fourth is jobs for people that otherwise would not be there because simply the shackles of colonialism haven't left. And the fifth is that it is an escape mechanism for lots of poverty that exists in the global south, as I've characterized in my frame. The impact of this is that at the end of the day, the West is in surplus, and we can actually actively change the lives of these people uniquely through migration by being able to physically access the benefits that they've created for themselves. Denying it is principally immoral. At the end of the day, you vote for Team Proposition because colonial countries have a duty to give back what they have taken away, and because Team Opposition supports a world in which they don't have to do anything because they're not morally obliged. I'm very proud to propose, and I beg you to please stand.
And now to open on behalf of the opposition, the floor goes to Op 1. Good luck.
In the age of empire, Europe painted itself as the land of hope and glory. By paying tribute to this false notion, the open borders of proposition shut the door on the most vulnerable, we of course. What is our policy and our stance? We believe that former colonial countries do not have an obligation to completely open their borders to past colonies. The alternative is developed countries then handing out aid to developing countries which are most desperately in need of this aid. Examples of this include direct cash injection, donating materials like for construction, or pushing MNCs to invest in less developed countries. Crucially, there are less developed nations may or may not be past colonies. But metrics for aid and need is the level of development and the level of need for aid, and those are the most relevant. This alternative proves already that even without a reparative duty and open borders, developing nations which may include past colonies already get the aid that they do need. Hence, no thank you, proposition's benefits are not unique on their side. All that is left is the harms of their policy. I'll explain later. Recognize that proposition today must prove why the reparative duty uniquely must be fulfilled in the specific mechanism of an open border. They have not done so. In this debate, no thank you, proposition must defend a very specific policy of open borders. They must show why the problems they raise cannot be solved by any other means, such as foreign aid, investment, or loans. No thank you. We don't need to defend any of these measures in particular, but proposition must identify a specific set of problems that can only be solved through their policy. They claim that they can stand for an extension, that they can stand for more than just opening borders and external aid. First, no, because the motion says that a unique obligation is to justify why uniquely in opening borders they fulfill their special reparative obligation. And I'll prove later in my arguments why their policy and status quo are mutually exclusive. They cannot extend to other measures. No thank you. Therefore, generic arguments on their side about why developing countries need help do not fulfill their burden. Two rebuttals for today's debate. First, on whether a retribution is actually justified. Second, on whether they actually engender change on the ground. First, on whether retribution exists on their side. Recognize that by their very own metrics of direct complicity, there is no justification for retribution on today's people. We completely agree with proposition on the historical injustices. But I don't think that the 3 minutes first proposition spends on analysing what colonialism was like or was relevant or particularly strategic in today's debate. Because we agree those injustices were committed before. But by their very own metric of direct complicity, the people of today weren't around back then to implement those injustices on the people in the past. No thank you. A more sensible line coming up from their first argument is, oppression still lives today through the form of new colonialist MNCs in status quo. But recognize that this problem isn't solved on proposition either, because free movement of people doesn't stop this exploitation. If anything, people are only going to move out of the former colonies to developed nations and work for the very MNCs who they claim are exploiting underdeveloped nations. How do we better stop it on our side? No thank you. When you have better lobbying from these former colonies, from LDCs for example, which only can happen on our side because we have mechanisms to improve these nations, I'll explain later in my argument. Second, on whether they actually engender change on their side. Recognize that there are 5 unlisted but unexplained reasons of how they get change. It's basically just an assertion of outcomes. There's no mechanism on their side why this is the case. Let me just give you one example. On remittance, for example. Recognize that on their side, remittance doesn't occur. Because with open borders, you move your entire family from the former colony to the nation. There's no one left in your country to remit money back to. It is on our side, when you're the only one who goes over, that you have an incentive to remit money back. More on this in my second argument. My first argument is on how nations owe a greater obligation to their citizens, and my second argument is on how the open borders hurt past colonies. My second speaker will argue about fueling right-wing nationalism in former colonial nations. So first argument, on the moral obligations to your own citizens. States owe greater obligations to their own citizens, because past historical injustices do not necessarily lead to moral obligations, especially when it is modern-day citizens in post-colonial countries who pay the price. No thank you. Similar to how we think parents owe an obligation to their own children over another poor, starving child that is not of their own, states need to take care of their own citizens for 2 reasons. First, for citizens in post-colonial states, they can only be taken care of by this government. They pay taxes, they give up rights and freedoms. It is if this state does not care for them, no one else will. The poor individuals on their side still can, at the very least, no thank you, be taken care of by the former colonies. Second reason, because in many post-colonial, past colonial states, poverty is still rampant, and there are citizens and former colonizers who are suffering. In France and Spain, for example, heavy austerity measures are set in place, where unemployment in youth is as high as 30%. Between poor individuals in past colonial states and poor individuals in former colonies, we agree that their needs are similar, but states owe a specific obligation to their own citizens. With proposition, their principle is misplaced. First, because they don't answer the question on why specifically open borders fulfills their policy. But second, why is it that they use former colonies as a barometer of being in need of aid? Because not all former colonies, will thank you, are in positions of poverty. Canada and Australia, for example, were former colonies, but are generally well-to-do today. Instead of attempting to help these nations, resources could have been used to help countries in need of aid such as Thailand and Ethiopia who were never colonized before. What we value on opposition is helping people in status quo today who are alive, not people who do not exist anymore. No, thank you. Second argument on how it is counterproductive for former colonies on their side. And the thesis of this argument is that open immigration completes the work of past colonizers by stealing the key resources that former colonies have left: people. Open borders are not necessarily for the people that proposition claims to benefit. There are two broad groups of people who will move on their side. First, and most predominantly, rich and enfranchised individuals. People who can afford the plane ticket to move to past colonial states. People who can afford, hold on a moment sir, to resettle and buy houses, to contend with the high living costs in these countries. These are the individuals who will move over, not the people who they claim is escaping from poverty and oppression. Yes?
It is a status quo that rich people or people who are educated already migrate. It's the poor people who are actively denied the access to Europe because borders are closed. This is what we change.
Thank you, sir. First, I don't think that the poor people actually benefit on this later in my second argument. But on rich individuals, recognize that there's exponentially higher opportunities for richer individuals to move overseas. Because on your side, open borders means that they can bring everything, all their assets, all their money, all their families. That is what is stopping some rich individuals in status quo from moving. On their side, the wealthy individuals who go remove capital, they remove assets and expertise and labor from former colonies. These are professional, skilled laborers who could have helped to uplift the economies of these former colonies. They are all gone on-side proposition. But on the second group of people, on the poor that they claim they help, not all, but some will move. These are people who scrape together every single cent they have, sell all their homes, all their possessions to be able to move to a past colonial state. The problem is that they go over as lower class citizens. They face immense racism and xenophobia, they face microaggression on a day-to-day basis, and even hate crimes on the ground. These are individuals who are harmed on site proposition because these individuals are not accepted in the places that they go to. Given that they have no, and furthermore, recognize that ultimately the vote of proposition looks like this. Indian doctors and professionals who go over and benefit from those resources when they were the ones who were helped by colonialism. On their side, the poor individuals go over and suffer from xenophobia, racism, and the inability to be able to afford the cost of living in those countries. We believe that open borders shut the door on the most vulnerable, proud to oppose.
For that speech, and now to continue on the proposition, the floor goes to Prop 2. Good luck.
I don't think opposition really understands what moral obligation actually means, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're actually trying to prove is that they have a principal moral obligation to help these countries. We do that through retribution and the fact that they're actually completely negligent in the status quo. Also, I will need that, this. Okay, okay, so at the end of the day, if they prove the practical harms of any of these and still say that we actually have to have aid, they're inherently conceding to our principle that they have to have some sort of a moral obligation to help any of these countries. And if they don't prove to us why this moral obligation is extremely contingent only on aid, I don't understand how their alternative is not inherently conceding to the motion in the first place. Okay, so in my speech, I'll firstly go through the main negations and reconstructions. Secondly, I'll go through the argument, which is essentially that this is solving the humanitarian crisis of people dying when they try to immigrate otherwise. Let's talk about the reconstruction first. Firstly, we talk about how it is extremely hard to develop these countries in the first place, and that is why people should be having some form of ability to go. Note that this hard ability to develop is inherently coming from colonialism itself, because they inherently destroyed their economy at the point at which they reaped all of their natural resources in the first place, and destroyed their political system at the point at which they're not inherently going to be the best political system, because they have a huge incentive to control them in the first place. So inherently colonialism is the reason why so many migrants want to migrate from these countries. But then we talk about retribution itself, right? We talk about how countries are inherently complicit in doing all of these things and are negligent in the fact that they can actually prevent these humanitarian aids. They completely disengage with this principle simply because they say that today's people are not part of this issue. Four responses to this, right? Firstly, the current people of today already have some sort of benefits from colonialism itself. We ourselves have developed because of colonialism. Europe has developed because they completely destroyed Africa, right? Secondly, principle of continuity actually exists in democracies and in any world countries, right? At the end of the day, you can't completely start from zero at the point at which you reach a new government. You have to take into account every single part of the past that the country actually had. So this comes from colonialism. We can actually talk about it in the first place. Thirdly, we obviously have some current exploitation which was only possible because of colonialism, because they simply had the ability to destroy their political system enough so that the MNCs could come there. And they even financed the MNCs to destroy their environment and their entire political system as well. But lastly, let's talk about the trade-off, right? Because at the end of the day, they are saying that they're not completely responsible. Compare that to the giant humanitarian crisis that is currently happening. Compare that to so many people that are living in poverty because of colonialism. Compare that to so many parts about how the countries could actually save these countries in the first place. Simply because they're not negligent. Simply because they wouldn't be negligent in the first place. Let's talk about their negation. Firstly, they talk about how they have a moral obligation to their citizens because they provide taxes, because people are already in poverty there. Our first response is, then why would you provide aid to these countries if you want to have a moral obligation to your citizens in poverty? Why don't you just put all the money in these poverties? They're principally not consistent. But even if they were, right? Even the poorest individuals of France were inherently benefiting from the poorest individuals of India. I do not understand how they're the principal majority of this case. I don't understand how they are not the ones reaping the benefits from it. They have been simply because our countries were able to develop in this way, and they would currently not even be alive and would be starving if that would not be the case. So inherently, they're also to blame that colonialism destroyed other countries. Then talk about how this open borders is going to be harmful for their migrants. Okay, sure, actually, yes.
Are you honestly saying that a homeless man forced to buy cat food because it's cheaper than real food is complicit in the actions of British Petroleum and Shell in these countries?
No, but he is reaping the benefits of cat food at the point at which it doesn't cost 10 euros per every single box. He's reaping the benefits of his ability to go to homeless shelters. He's reaping the abilities for reaching some sort of clothes in the first place. Note that every single homeless man in India is not able to do all of these things. Okay, so inherently, what I'm saying here is every single individual benefited from colonialism. Please engage with the principle in the first place. Okay, so they talk about the open borders policy and how this is inherently taking away every individual from these countries. Two responses to this. Firstly, we're not coercing them into going to these countries. We're simply giving them the option to choose to go to these countries, which they should have on a principle level, since they were politically and economically disenfranchised simply because of colonialism in the first place. But secondly, let's talk about the current status quo, because I don't think they actually understand who is currently migrating, because we don't have completely closed borders either, right? The richest people on earth are currently migrating from India to, I don't know, whatever, like France, I don't really care. At the end of the day, the current situation is that the people that can actually develop the country are already moving. The problem here is that the other individuals also want to move. I'll talk about that in my later constructive. And then they talk about racism and xenophobia. Firstly, they provide you no proof of what that actually looks like. Secondly, we talk about the trade-off in the first place, right? Because at the end of the day, if people are racist towards me, but at the same time I'm able to access some sort of social welfare, I will still be surviving till the end of this year. But lastly, the principle is here the core. So I don't understand how the practical actually implies we're giving the people the ability to choose and thus survive in a better society. Let's talk about our constructive. Okay, looking at the news today, 5 more bodies washed up on the shore simply because people wanted to have better lives. Simply because people did not want to live in this poverty society in a political structure that inherently caused that. Panel, people are dying. People are dying because they want to have better lives. And we have an understanding to actually save them, and we have a mechanism in order to provide them so that they won't be drowning on the first place. First, Why are they actually doing
Point
so?
of information.
There is a strong incentive for people to migrate. Firstly, there's the monetary, and secondly, there's obviously the political incentives, since there's a lot of refugees in the current situation. Secondly, we talk about the borders currently for these people are completely shut, because at the end of the day, if you want to apply for a visa, if you want to apply for a job in, for example, the US, you cannot possibly be someone of the lower classes. Note that those are the only individuals that are the most affected by all of these statements. So essentially, for a large part of the population, these borders are shut. So many are unable to cross the border in the legal way. However, there is a strong incentive for them to do so in other ways, and simply because they're not A, informed, and C, B, don't really care about all of the possible implications that they're going to die. They end up freezing to death in trucks, and they end up drowning in the middle of the Mediterranean. People inherently die. What opening borders means is that we provide them a safer way to do so. What do the colonialist countries actually have an obligation to do this? Simply because, firstly, people are dying, and every single country should have an obligation to help this migrant crisis. But secondly, they have an inherent obligation because they're the ones that inherently caused this in the first place, because they inherently made their economic system so bad, and they inherently reaped all of the benefits and made themselves look so much more amazing. They're the ones to blame for every single child that lost their lives on the Mediterranean. They're the ones to blame for every single girl that lost his life and then freeze to death in a truck. For the reasons that colonialist world didn't really pay off any much of the benefits for individuals, and the reason why so many people are currently dying and it should have the obligation, it should have the ability to have a better life. Please vote off the proposition.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. And now to continue on behalf of the opposition, the floor goes to Op 2. Good luck.
Proposition has not engaged with Matthew's principle. She accuses us of a contradiction. Let me just clear this up, because it wasn't. What did we tell you? States have a moral obligation primarily to their own citizens. Our case is twofold. First, it is morally praiseworthy to help former colonial countries, but it is even more morally praiseworthy to help individuals who need it the most. We're not saying that this is a moral obligation, but we say that states should only do these things at the consent of their own citizens. And our case is that the side of the proposition reduces the consent of citizens to carry out policies that genuinely helps these individuals. I want to talk about three things in this speech. First, on the moral obligation. Second, on what post-colonial countries really need. And lastly, I want to talk to you about what actually helps whether or not these people live good lives within these countries. So first, on the moral obligation that exists. The claim of the proposition is that colonialism has happened and therefore you ought to have open borders. This is incredibly unspecific logic. The payment for colonialism, using their logic, could just as easily be McDonald's Happy Meals as it is an open border on their side of the house. But also, more importantly, I think they miss out the significant problem and principal duty that exists. When states come and take taxes away from poor individuals within their own nations, these individuals themselves suffer. The problem is that states today don't have a surplus of cash just lying around. Austerity measures in Greece, France, and the Netherlands around the world tell us that they don't have the money to help everyone. So the question in this debate is, who should be prioritized then? We give to you multiple reasons on our side because of the social contract as to why these individuals are supported. What was their claim? But you benefited from colonialism and you are currently perpetrating MNC neocolonialism. This is just untrue. I'm sorry, the poor man on the ground has absolutely nothing to do with British Petroleum. He doesn't sit on their board. He doesn't control their actions. Second, a more specific measure would be to rein in multinational companies using regulations rather than open borders. But also, I would suggest that they actually fuel the increase in resource extraction, because now multinational corporations don't even have to enter into the developing world. They don't even have to bother building up infrastructure because the cheap labor comes directly to them. What happens then? This means that resources are extracted on their side. Companies come into the developing world only primarily to extract resources and don't even set up infrastructure because there's absolutely no need because open borders exist on their side of the house. Furthermore, because these individuals were not chosen to have any form of colonialism, we think that they should not be in the face of all of these harm. They should not be forced to pay the price for their grandfathers. They did not have any form of answer to this. Second, what do these post-colonial nations need? I would submit, as they point out, that post-colonial nations need to develop their own economies because there are millions of people around the world who can't move. They misrepresent what Matthew tells you. What Matthew was talking about was not just the rich, but individuals in the middle class or even individuals, for example, who have basic skills. Individuals in construction, for example, setting up shops, basic accountancy, all the little things that are required to build a long-lasting economy are lost on their side of the house when such individuals are able to move to these countries. They don't come back. Their response is remittances. I'm sorry guys, you can't build an economy entirely on remittances. You actually need to have food, supermarkets, jobs, roads, trains. These are the things that are required to build it. They refuse the incentive to do so. Furthermore, they give an excellent incentive to developing countries on their side to not develop infrastructure. Because now they say, if you don't like our country, you can move straight to these colonial nations. There's absolutely no response to this. The next thing I have to point out is on the specificity of aid. Some nations need aid more than others. The problem with this is that you reduce the political capital that is needed. So what does this mean? Developmental aid isn't given on their side of the house. Nations like nations like the United States, the United Kingdom don't have foreign aid to do things like build schools, hospitals, because they have open borders. It's extremely hard to tell your people, I'm going to give these people open borders because of the fact that they were post-colonial nations, and then spend even more money helping people in countries that weren't colonized by you. What does this mean? This means that the people who actually need it are reduced. They don't have the schools, aid, etc. that they have on their side of the house. They leave poor people in the lurch. Individuals who live in poverty, who have never heard of the opportunities that they are talking about. Individuals who live in tin roofs, who are never going to hear it. They don't get these benefits. They don't get the school to educate them. Nothing on their side of the house. Last thing to talk about here. Do you get a better life? I would submit that they don't. Because when you enter a country that doesn't have a surplus of jobs, you are fed the lie by proposition that says that all will be better. This is untrue. In many parts of the developed world, jobs are scarce. Xenophobia is rife. The second proposition speaker asks us for evidence of xenophobia. I mean, please, Boris Johnson just won an election based on xenophobia. Donald Trump won an entire election based on kicking out Mexicans. I'm sorry guys, if you're telling me that xenophobic reactions don't exist, that is a straight up lie. Furthermore, we've explained to you that these individuals are unlikely to get the jobs. So what happens on their side of the house instead? These people come to these nations, rather than a nation will be better for them. Because these nations then close off their borders to countries that need it. So Germany is now forced, for example, to open their borders to Togo, rather than the Syrian migrants that really need it on their side of the house. If they want to talk about Syrian migrants and individuals who suffer on their side of the house, I suggest it becomes much worse when you can't enter a country that is geographically proximitous to you because of the fact that these individuals are now shutting off their borders to anyone that's not from their post-colonial state. When these individuals enter a country based on the false hopes and dreams that proposition sends them, when they have no food, no job, no labor, no homes, they don't have the infrastructure to benefit them, that's when they're stranded in these countries with absolutely no benefits. Proposition sells them a lie, they don't even bother to help them. Before that, please.
Why is the moral obligation to help a country that you colonize and the moral obligation to help someone in need mutually exclusive?
Because money is mutually exclusive. You have $1 million, you can spend it on one or two places. We suggest to you that countries should spend their money on people that need it more, that is, their own citizens. And listen to Matthew's logic. Moving on. Let's move on to the team's third and final argument about why this policy fuels xenophobia. Recognize that the thesis of this argument is that a policy of open borders leads to a rise in resentment and xenophobia, leading to a lower standard of living for both minorities within post-colonial states and also these individuals who move. What's the premise of this argument? Around the world, right-wing populism against immigration has been on the rise. At its core is a fear of individuals or what they perceive to be foreigners. And recognize, I'm sorry, if this sentiment is not logical, it doesn't matter if they're actually not taking your job, but the fear of the encroachment on your nation is enough to accuse these individuals of taking your jobs, especially when the economy is bad. When individuals lose their jobs in places like Mexico, for example, correlation can often seem to a lot like causation. What does this mean? This means that an overall atmosphere of hate is created, a rise in hate crimes, the voting in of parties that deny help to these individuals just because Just because you move to a country doesn't mean that they're going to give you social welfare, because you're not a citizen of that country. And they vote in governments that don't give them these kinds of social welfare because they're not a citizen of these states. What does this mean? This often looks like the creation of enclaves, because these individuals need to feel safe in these communities. They don't integrate into local communities because governments don't help them, where they're abandoned by government services, isolated and unable to gain the benefits on their side of the house. This harm is not just economic, but human. When you're told that you're not belonging to a country, you're not important. This also harms racial minorities within the country that are already having trouble. African Americans in the United States, Latinos in the United States, even Pakistanis who already moved to the United Kingdom. All of these individuals are harmed and lumped together, and they can't even move. This is also a moral obligation that proposition doesn't help. We believe that open borders shut the doors on the most vulnerable. I've never been prouder to stand on opposition.
Alright, thank you very much for that speech. And now to continue on behalf of the proposition, the floor goes to Prop 3. Good luck.
Panel, I believe it's rather funny and ridiculous that it's the side of the opposition that claims that they fight for the poor common man in Africa, which was colonized, while at the same time still fighting for their own citizen in their country. They have a strong discussion in their case. We are very proud to stand on the side of the proposition. In my speech, we shall do three classic things. Firstly, I shall respond to the third substantive brought up by the opposition. Then we shall move on to the two fundamental questions, which will be firstly, which side is more principally better off? Secondly, which side is more practically beneficial to all the stakeholders in this round? First thing, the third argument. They say it fuels xenophobia by opening borders. We have numerous responses to this, already tackled by Shiva, by the way, in her second prop, no engagement on the side of the house. Firstly, we said we do not care about the arbitrary things about like racism and so on, simply because if we have the trade-off of a moral obligation to help these people, right? At a point of which I'm screamed at with a racist slur on the street by still accessing education, welfare, all of these things in Western countries, we see that this is a better trade-off, and this is something that exclusively do not get on the side of the opposition, which only happens when you migrate to a country and can access these things. The trade-off is on the proposition. Secondly, we say that no, racism happens less on the side of the proposition, at a point at which you actually have migration that's happening at large scale, which means that mixing of races and cultures can happen, right? Because opposition is the side where you have cultures who do not even know each other, and we say that racism and xenophobia and discrimination comes out of people not knowing the other cultures. This happens more because we have more mixing on our side of the house. We saw this better off on proposition. But thirdly, we do realize and we do recognize there has been an increase for the support for the far right in Europe, especially because of the migration crisis, which, by the way, no thank you, is a political crisis, which was directly caused by France and UK carving up Syria not along national lines, but along the lines that they arbitrarily set on. We say that the Western, like centrist and social democrat parties, recognize that xenophobia is a problem, but then they have more incentive to actively help those countries in the East, in the third world, no thank you, because they don't want those far righties in power. We can see that the third argument already falls because of all these reasons. Now with this, let's move on to the two fundamental questions of this round. Firstly, which side is more? It's more it's practically the one decided you should. It's principally decided you should vote on. But before we get into that, let's have three other points of strategy by which the opposition already loses this round. Firstly, about the model and about the burdens of which this round takes place. Firstly, about the aid. This is their alternative.
Point of information.
No thank you. This is the alternative that they so stand on the side of the opposition. Firstly, we say that this is something that we can still support on the side of the proposition. And also notice that this is a status quo that is is present in the society, right? Because the West does help the third world with aid and so on. The West does not, however, let people to access the benefits in these countries because the borders are closed. So, but you can see that all the problems we talk about in this round are still present under their status quo, which is only aid. And this is also something we can stand on because we are principally consistent with that. We'll put that on, we'll put contribution because this is the principle that we stand on, but we'll also put that as a
Point.
No, thank you. Secondly, we said that we are morally obliged to help, and at the point of which their criteria is that we give them some aid, so that they are already buying into our principle, which they have little engagement with, by the way, I haven't noticed around the line. But we said that at the point of which they want to have aid, this is already considered to the point that we have a moral obligation. And even though their reasons are practical, the reasons for doing aid are based on the idea that we have some kind of moral obligation. So they're already losing on the point of the burden which they have to defend. And secondly, about the developed nations, about Ethiopia, Thailand, and support, and like what are the cases that we talk about. Ethiopia and Thailand are the exact exception of the countries that weren't colonized. If they want to defend these countries, we are talking about countries that were specifically colonized and about all the harms that the West has imposed historically and is imposing now today on these countries. First point, the principle. Look.
Point of information.
Oh, thank you.
Why is the individual from Australia who does not need help upliftment from poverty prioritized over that poor citizen in Ethiopia who's suffering from famines and homelessness?
No, we said that look, if you provide us a criteria by which these people are exploited as well, we'll put them, we'll have them come into our countries as well. But they cannot squirrel us out on Ethiopia and Thailand, right? Look, the whole of the third world, except for Thailand and Ethiopia, was colonized, right? The whole continent of Africa, Australia, Indonesia, South America, all of that. They can squirrel out that, but even if they do, we can still accept them. The principle. We provide you a unique principal argument where we talk to you about the retribution and about how exploitation still happens, right? And the only response that the opposition really has is that historically they weren't the ones responsible for this. We say exactly because countries currently in the West are benefiting from historic exploitation, they have a moral obligation to do something about it, right? Because the reason why we have a disparity between the West and the third world is exactly because of historic exploitation that the West has imposed on the third world and by economic exploitation, right? But secondly, we also say that the principle of continuity still stands, right? Because the governments in the past were responsible for this, therefore the governments here still need to abide by these rules, right? But thirdly, we also say that current exploitation is now no longer so direct, right? It's more subtle in the terms of MNCs, which the West is currently still actively supporting in terms of subsidies and in terms of allowing them to go into these countries in the first place, right? But even if they weren't, no, thank you, even if they weren't actively responsible, the reasons why MNCs can exploit these countries is exactly because of the bad political and economic situation, which came in the first place because of colonialism, because the West has imposed and has been destroying colonialism for the past 300 years. So this is the reality that we currently live in. But at the end of the day, when you're weighing principle, notice what you're weighing. On one side, you're weighing the principle that we need to help those who were harmed actively in the past and who are currently harmed even as well. No, thank you. You're weighing this principle, which is nuancely analyzed, against the principle that we should help our own citizens and that we should help. We have no historical connection to the situation that's currently happening and is happening in the past. Second point of principle about the ability to help their own citizens. Look, we can even stand by that, right? We can even stand that countries can help their own citizens as well if they are displaced. The side of the opposition has to prove to the while there's a concrete moral obligation that we do not help those people who are in the third world and those people who are homeless.
Information.
No, thank you. Second, we also say that those people need more help because of the exploitation provided by the West and imposed by the West on the third world, right? Exactly because those people are exploited and they are more exploited than the poor man in the West. Therefore, they should have the ability to access the profits and to access the points in the West that is exclusively in the West, right? The poor man in Europe has, on a comparative, still a better situation than a poor man from the third world, because they still have the access to certain benefits that exist already in the West, such as infrastructure and so on. But secondly, about the practical, right? But notice how we exclusively, just by proving you this principle that I have talked about, already win this debate, which specifically calls about the moral obligation. But now let's talk quickly about the practical. Look, the main idea is that exactly by migration, you can actively access all the benefits in the country. You can access the education, the infrastructure, the social welfare. Notice that all of these things do not exist in the third world. They do not exist in the colonized countries, exactly because of colonization, which actively prevented this from developing in the first place. By allowing migration, we give those people who do not have a chance to actually do something about their lives and to have a perspective future. But secondly, about the long-term strategy. At the end of the day, we also recognize that because of because of xenophobia, people like countries in Europe will likely invest in those countries to prevent this from happening. But secondly, we also say it's the incentive of those people to send some money back, it's the incentive of those people to actually help their communities back at home. The offer is our proposition, principally consistent, practically better. Both ways.
Alright, thank you very much for that speech. And now for the next speech on the opposition, the floor goes to Op 3. Good luck.
We saw a very interesting shift in priorities in their previous speaker. If you notice, their case has become almost exclusively about obligations and they've stopped talking about the practical part of their case. The 5 exclusive unique benefits they mentioned in first proposition, unheard of in second and third. I think it's particularly indicative that the previous speaker only spends 30 seconds on the practical part of this debate because I think they know that that's where they've lost. I'm going to answer 2 questions in this speech. First, is there a principal moral obligation to open borders? Second, which side is practically better for citizens of developing countries? Let's be clear, if we win on either of these clashes, we take the debate. Why is this true? Because if we can prove that there's no obligation, they lose the main pillar of their case and they don't prove the motion. If we can prove that practically, life doesn't get better for those in ex-colonies, they don't fulfill their obligation even if it exists. So if we win either clash, we take the debate. I'm going to prove to you how we've won on both. So first, is there a principal moral obligation to open your borders? And under this clash, I'm going to talk about 3 things. First, there isn't an obligation. Second, on our competing obligation. And third, why must there be an obligation in this specific way? So first, there is no moral obligation. We told you that we were never going to deny that colonialism was awful. But we told you that the generation who lives in developed countries now is different from the generation who was complicit. There were a couple of lines of response. The first thing they say is that, well, you benefited from colonialism. This doesn't mean that you're complicit at all. Here's a clear example. If the world's best tennis player is murdered, the world's second best tennis player obviously benefits. But that doesn't mean he was at all complicit in the actions that happened to the world's best tennis player. So this is one of the examples that prove that just because you benefit from something doesn't mean you're complicit. The second line of response they have is that MNCs exploit individuals in the developing world. And we've had a number of responses down the line. First, we told you that this extends beyond colonialism, that US MNCs exploiting India, even though the US never colonized India, so presumably they don't solve this. Second, we explained to you that their mechanism does nothing to this. Allowing India open borders to the UK does not mean that MNCs stop exploiting India. Third, we told you in second speaker that average citizens in past colonial master nations are not negligent or responsible for this. We explained to you that the average British citizen does not sit on the board of British Petroleum and therefore is not negligent in their actions. If the motion was this House believes there's an obligation for MNCs to those they exploit, then sure, this argument would be relevant. But they've never explained to us why it must be from past colonial masters to past colonies. That's why the MNC exploitation argument makes no sense. So next, on our completing principal obligation. We told you that states owe an obligation to their own citizens. And we told you it was mutually exclusive because of limited welfare services in countries all across Europe and North America. Gareth talks to you about austerity making welfare services cash-strapped. You think every new person who is covered by the NHS in the UK means that there's less money for each person under that service. Each person who moves into your town means land prices go up. So yes, it is a mutually exclusive obligation to your own citizens and to taking immigrants from past colonies. Finally, even if it exists, why must the obligation be fulfilled in this way? And this is important because to win the debate, proposition must tell you why it has to be completely open borders. And we only hear a response to this, finally, something in third speaker. He says there's lots of aid in the status quo, but it's still problematic. Yes, we don't have to defend an immediate nor a perfect solution. We don't have to defend getting 3 billion people out of poverty immediately. But the important point is this, that things are improving. Hospitals and roads in India, microfinancing in Bangladesh. These are all things that are new, things that have come up in the 21st century. This is what we support on our side. What they need to prove is that they can have this as well. Notably, Matthew explains to you how they reduce political capital for all these other services. Because citizens in the UK and France will be like, well, you're accepting immigrants, why are you still giving aid to them? We said it right at the top of this debate, we still haven't heard a response from them. Whether or not they support this doesn't matter in this debate because they have no political capital to continue with the aid that has been working in status quo. What have we shown you? First, there is no retributive obligation at stake here. Second, we've given you a competing principal obligation that they don't fulfill. Third, even if we accept there's an obligation, they don't fulfill their burden to prove the motion because they've never told us why the obligation must be fulfilled in completely open borders. Second clash in this debate. Do they really help people in past colonies? I'm going to talk about 3 things under this clash. First, who gets to migrate on their side? Second, what happens to those who stay? Third, what happens to those who leave? So who gets to leave on their side? We explained to you right from the top of this debate that poorer individuals were never going to make use of the open borders on their side because it takes a huge amount of money to relocate your entire family halfway across the world and start a new life. They say rich people already migrate. No, thank you. That's not necessarily true. Maybe millionaire businessmen migrate on their side. But the next level, the skilled professionals, the doctors, the engineers, the teachers, that's who don't get a visa on our side because there's already an oversupply of professionals in developing countries. It is these individuals who are only going to get to migrate on their side, leaving behind the working class, the poorest of the poor. So regardless of whether it's coercive or not, the fact that these individuals want to leave, are going to leave, they're going to leave everyone else behind. Notably, this also attacks the principle. It destroys their moral claim because they don't help those who were most harmed by colonialism. They talk for a long time about homeless people in India in second speaker. Which homeless person in India can afford a flight for his entire family to the UK? We think none of them can. If they really want to claim the most vulnerable actors, they needed to give us a mechanism. We're still waiting, even though it's been 3 speakers. So we think that their benefits are massively overclaimed. Those most hurt by colonialism, the most vulnerable, the homeless individuals, none of them are going to get to go on their side. Sure.
At the end of the day, even if we prove to you that the moral obligation for your own citizen is stronger, we've shown you there is a moral obligation, which is inherently the motion.
First of all, we've given you a number of responses as to why there is no moral obligation. Second, the motion is not just you have a moral obligation, but you have a moral obligation to completely open borders. Insofar as we can prove to you that opening your borders harms your own citizens, and insofar as they concede that you have an obligation to your own citizens, that means that you don't have an obligation to completely open borders. So moving on, what happens to those who cannot leave? On proposition, it is when the poorest of the poor are left behind and poverty becomes rampant because of brain drain and a shrinking tax base. When we prevent this, that is how we help the common man in Africa as well as the citizens in the UK and France. So it's not a disconnect in our case, it's 2 separate mechanisms that help 2 separate actors. Notably, again, this is something we brought up in Matthew. Right from the top of this debate, we talked about the people left behind, and it's an actor that they never ever wanted to engage with. So I'm not going to take them at their best. What happens to those who can leave? They say that, oh, assimilation prevents racism. That's not true. We've seen enclaving in many parts of the world, like Birmingham in the UK, where there's huge racism that forces Indian immigrants into one specific place. The next response is, racism doesn't matter because you get benefits. This is, again, ridiculous, because when people are racist to you, it means you don't get a job because of the color of your skin. It means you don't get your kids into a school because of the color of their skin, so you don't get benefits on their side of the house. Finally, at the end of my speech, I want to take them at their best. Let's say racism doesn't exist. Let's say they really manage to help those who get into to get into the countries of post-colonial masters. There is always an opportunity cost. Helping the rich Indian doctor on proposition versus the poor factory worker on opposition. Giving resources to US immigrants on their side versus homeless British people on our side. Helping countries like Canada and Australia versus non-colonized ones like Ethiopia. This is again response to what they say in third speaker. Yes, we agree. The homeless person in the UK has a better life than the homeless person in India. But the homeless person in the UK does not have a better life than the Indian doctor who is going going to be the one moving on their side. The case of the opposition is this. There is no moral obligation, even if it is. Proposition don't help fulfill it when they harm the most vulnerable, and they haven't proven why this is the way to fulfill their moral obligation. They shut the door on the most vulnerable. I'm very proud to oppose.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. And now for the first summary speech of this debate, on reply. Good luck.
When faced with a moral question, it's sometimes very easy to act instinctively. It's very easy to just say we ought to open borders, we need to help everyone now. But when you think like that, you don't really think about the consequences of your actions. Moral obligations don't just happen in a vacuum. It's about whether or not the actions that you carry out genuinely help people on the ground. And when you hear the concession after concession made by third proposition, when he drops the practical argumentation, if you harm people in post-colonial societies, then you don't have a moral obligation to carry it out. We're very proud to oppose. Let's take a look at the two worlds that emerge at the end of this debate. And I want to show to you why the world of the opposition was a world that built a more sustainable world for post-colonial countries, whereas proposition shackles them in the developed world with xenophobia and racism. Let's take a look at the world of the proposition. It was a world that built entire economies on remittances, not caring about the actual needs of the developing world. It was a world where the countries like the United States couldn't help countries like the India or Bangladesh because they didn't have former colonial masters. It was countries like the United Kingdom who couldn't help individuals across the world. They can't help places that were used to be conquered by the French. Theirs is a world in which the infrastructure that needs to be built is not built because France and other such nations say, we've already opened our borders, what's the point of aid? Theirs is a world where the uneducated child can't get to school because it was never built. Theirs is a world where the man who lives in a slum can't get a job because MNCs don't enter, they rely on the cheap labor that is flowing to their country. Theirs is a world in which individuals cannot get the sustainable things that they need in order to develop. And if that is their principal obligation, then I suggest that that's just straight up wrong. It is in the world of the proposition where they say that, xenophobia is okay because, oh well, at least you're in the country. But being in a country doesn't mean that you get benefits. You kind of need to be a citizen first. You need to vote in a government that's willing to install infrastructure that benefits you. And if all the immigrants happen to be in an enclave where governments can ignore service to you, then you don't get the job. You don't get the education, you don't get the police force, you don't get the products. This xenophobia is something that side proposition hasn't tackled with despite the chance in third proposition. If these individuals in the world of proposition are sold the lie that they can live a better life and move, or when they finally do, they don't get a world that they can live in, that's horrible. But it was a world that misunderstood what we were saying. It was a world where immigrants couldn't go to the nation that benefited them most. Because Germany can't open its borders to Syria anymore because it's accepting immigrants from Togo. And that's something that the people of Germany will tell its government. So if they want to call us out on the Syrian child, I think the Syrian child trying to move to Germany is harmed on their side of the house. And they don't have a response to any of this. So the world of proposition is a world of aid denied. It's a world where governments and the poor don't get what they need in the developing world. It's a world where even when they do move, they're punished, they're shackled, they're caused by racism. No response. Let's talk about the world of the opposition. The world of the opposition was a lot better. It was a world where we understood that an obligation was important, but it also understood that the distinction between moral praiseworthiness and moral obligation was important. That citizens on the ground who are homeless, who freeze to death in the winter, were not benefited by colonialism. Where regulations against MNCs can still be carried out without the need for this policy on proposition. It was a world which benefited and gave incentives for countries and companies to build infrastructure in these nations. It was a world where not just doctors and lawyers could enter, but everyone, because your country opens the borders to people who need it. not just those from post-colonial states. It was the world of the opposition that gave you an actual solution, because the people in the developing world will not take solace in the moral angst of side proposition. They want food in their stomachs, not a principle that they can't eat. We believe that in the world of the opposition, open borders shut the doors on the most vulnerable. We've never been prouder to stand on opposition.
Alright, thank you very much for that speech. And now for the final speech of this debate, the floor goes to Prof. Eli. Good luck.
Panel, this motion was about opening borders and if it's principally legitimate. If countries who have actively gone to others and exploited them and taken their resources and taken their economic ability for any sort of progress and taken their ability to actually benefit from the aid that they want to provide, if they have a moral obligation to have some recompense in today's debate. We said very clearly on our side that they do have, and this obligation extends to the very policy that they want to stand for. I'm going to show to you why the principle should not die in this debate, and it should not be bought. You should not buy their mechanistic quibbles that they respond to by. What do we tell you? One, we tell you that retribution is necessary at the point at which you're directly complicit in the past, and you're directly complicit in status quo, and you're negligent in status quo, and you're negligent in the past. Lots of analysis, and their only two responses are like, but the people in the current world shouldn't be complicit for the past actions of their neighbor or of their grandfathers, right? We say three things that have no response from them. One, they're directly benefited at the point at which you're able to actually have a stable economy simply through the process of colonialism in the first place. Wealthy countries are wealthy not because they magically turned up as having lots of money, but because they actively exploit people who otherwise could not fend for themselves. The second is the principle of continuity, which gets absolutely no response, and you cannot start from day zero. You actually have to look past what you've done in the past and look it through in an end. And thirdly, MNCs. They try to mischaracterize our point about MNCs as being purely a practical point and how we're not solving it. Panel, don't be fooled by their language. That wasn't the point of it. MNCs are the direct reason why there is some sort of current direct complicity to these countries on a principle level, not on a practical. Sure, we're not claiming we're completely solving MNCs. There's a gray area here, but on a moral level, we think that MNCs are negligent to the countries on form of neocolonialism. That was the principal justification for solving this. And they buy this principle, panel, note, because they say that they would provide aid, which firstly, we can do as well, not mutually exclusive on a moral level, but secondly, goes against their very case. Their very case is, one, people are, current people should not be harmed for older generations, and two, you should not harm the poor. And they don't clear this up, right? They don't show you why sending aid is somehow different from actively helping or actively harming the poor, because all the money isn't going to the NHS, all the money isn't going to the healthcare system, but B, because these people are not directly complicit, their taxpayer money shouldn't go to the people in the developing countries in the global south in the first place. This is a huge this is a huge contradiction in their case. They haven't dealt with it anywhere. But then their only other response to our principle is saying that it's a contingent argument on the practical effects and that these things don't exist in a vacuum. But panel, I'm going to use Bill Sales' shoe analogy here. Look, if I steal your shoe, the only recompense, the only proportional recompense is to give you your shoe back. We think it's just principally abhorrent for them to say that these people don't have the moral obligation because of some sort of practical effects that could happen. No, we say that the direct exploitation necessarily needs the direct recompense of actively helping them. And sure, we can support other policies and extensions on our side of the house as well. They don't show you why it's mutually exclusive to the motion. Their only mechanistic quibbles are about practical impact for the people in these countries. But one, Jiva provides you a very good argument that gets very no response, which is basically about illegal immigrants who are unable to get the mechanism to leave their country, and now they uniquely do at the point at which you open the borders and give them that escape mechanism from poverty, something that is illegitimately taken away from them because the poverty was induced by the very same colonizers that they want to stand for, like that they want to help on the poor side, on their side of the house. Furthermore, we told you about how at the point at which you're an asylum seeker, you're able to get the benefits of the country that you have actually helped get in the first place. Panel, because we're principally consistent and because the principles should not die in this debate, but also because we help people on the practical level, I'm very proud to propose, and I beg you to do so.